Hello everyone, I'm Mark Connors, and welcome to How It Ticks, the go-to podcast for anyone with a spark of curiosity about the inner workings of Switzerland. Hosted by yours truly, an Australian expat with a deep curiosity, How It Ticks offers a platform where listeners are invited to explore the vast landscape of Swiss culture, business, innovation, and tradition. Each episode features a one-on-one interview with experts and thought leaders from various fields, providing a panoramic view of what makes Switzerland tick. If you are like me and you enjoy listening to successful people share their insights, this podcast is for you. What does it take for businesses to prepare for the growing threat of climate change? How can events like flooding in one country ripple across the supply chain globally? And what role do cities like Zurich play in adapting to these risks? In this episode, I sit down with Annemarie Büttner, lead of climate risk solutions at Swiss Re, to explore how companies can identify, assess, and mitigate climate risks in an increasingly unpredictable world. We discuss the science behind climate risk modeling, the kinds of data used to predict future catastrophes, and the practical actions businesses can take to safeguard their operations. Annemarie shares interesting examples like how flooding in Spain can disrupt supply chains for a company in Switzerland, highlighting the real-world consequences of ignoring climate risks. We explore how climate change is impacting Switzerland and other parts of Europe, from melting glaciers to large-scale landslides. Annemarie also offers advice to individuals and companies on how to prepare for a changing climate and shares her optimism for a future where proactive planning can make a difference. Enjoy. Annemarie, thank you so much for joining How It Ticks. How are you?
Hello, I'm great. Thanks for the invite, Mike.
So, lead climate risk solutions. That sounds interesting. And one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you today was because I wanted to understand more where Switzerland is at the moment regarding the climate and how they assess climate risk. But before going there, can you maybe explain to me a bit about what your industry is and how you got to where you are?
Yes, very happy to. So, my background is environmental engineering, and so when I studied at the typical university in Munich, I thought what would be most interesting in this whole climate or natural space, environmental space, and I came to natural catastrophes. I found that incredibly interesting, like how nature hits back on us at the most unexpected times, and so example, how we're impacting our daily lives with floodings or with storms or these really big events that are really shaking us up. So that's how I decided to go into the industry and become a natural catastrophe modeler at the time. So I work in the insurance and reinsurance industry throughout my career so far, and we are looking at the big events that are really shaking up societies. And with climate change, we're seeing that events have shifted. So storm patterns are starting to shift, flood patterns maybe intensifying in some areas of the world. We see new or more coming perils like droughts. And I really wanted to study that better and understand what journey we're on to, where we're up to going forward. So what I do is I work with corporates all around the globe and help them to understand what climate risk means to them in terms of physical impacts. So how they will be impacted by more floods, more storms, droughts, supply chain interruptions, and so on. And just to give you an example of a headline that we recently had in our Swiss news, there is this train manufacturing company called Stadler, and their share value has really plunged because of a climate risk event. So there was a major flood in Spain. Their own facilities got flooded, but especially their suppliers got flooded. And so they really have a supply chain interruption and have major impacts into their whole business. So these are the events and these are the things we're looking at.
How much do companies need to do this and feel like they have to because every company has to care about the climate now? And how much of it is then being aware enough to go, this is really important for us to do because if we miss something, it could be catastrophe?
So there's very different clients. Some are really well prepared and some are completely surprised when we talk to them about these natural catastrophes and how they could be impacted. So it really depends on who you speak to within a company. And there are some regulations like the EU taxonomy that have really that are a framework where corporates have to think about their climate risk. They have to report them. They have to get an understanding about where they're exposed. And this is a really good opener, first step for corporates to get acquainted with the climate risks that they are facing. So this is a good way to start the assessment. But of course, the regulation is only the first step. In the end, what we really need to do is adapt to the new normal of climate risks.
So this is climate risk in the sense that the impact the climate can have on companies, not the impact companies can have on the climate.
Exactly. You're just explaining the double materiality. And what I'm looking at is how climate change will impact the business and the operations of a company. So yes, how the climate is impacting us and not how we're impacting the climate.
Interesting. Can you explain a bit the process of how you would go about modeling climate risk? I mean, it makes sense at a very high level, but I'm curious what that actually looks like when you do the actual work.
Absolutely. So I would start with natural catastrophe modeling. So this is really the catastrophes like the flooding events, the storm events, the earthquakes that we're having at the moment. While a little bit, in brackets, earthquakes are not impacted by climate change. We're looking at the other ones, but in natural catastrophe modeling, we're looking at all these events. We look at where do we have assets all around the globe? We look at the different intensities and frequencies of these events all around the globe. We tie a vulnerability to it. So, for example, an office building that is 10 stories high is less vulnerable to flooding than like a storage facility, which is only like one floor and nothing is lifted, for example. So we tie different vulnerabilities to it. And then we run a financial model and calculate out of this hazard, vulnerability, and the exposure. And then we calculate together out of these three, really the financial impact. And from that, we derive also an insurance premium, for example, like very simply explained. But this is only the current risk. With the natural catastrophe models that we have so far, we're very much looking at the past. So how many losses did we have in the past? And that should tell us what the future is going to be. But now we got climate change really impacting the different flood and storm patterns, for example. And so we have to rethink this process. And for that, we take climate models that are representing how the future should look like. To simply explain it, we're looking at different future trajectories and try and understand how the precipitation patterns will be in 2030, 2050, and we put them on top of our current risk natural catastrophe models. And from that, we get an idea like, will your flood risk cost you in the future 20% more or 50% more, depending on the climate change scenario that we think we're on. Yeah, so that's how it works. We get the current risk, we put a future view on it based on different, for example, precipitation patterns.
So you can go as far as 20 or 30 years into the future. What degrees of certainty do you have as the time gets further and further out?
Yes, the CMF6 models go until 2100. We use a 30-year moving average. So the longest we'll look at is 2085. Yes, but of course the uncertainties increase with how long we will look into the future. And we don't have a crystal ball, but what we offer our clients to understand or really try to understand with them is which trajectory are we going towards? So what is the general direction of, for example, these precipitation patterns? But there is various limitations and uncertainties that are challenging the data and the field in general. So, for example, on a globe where we would like to have perfect global coverage. The reality is a bit different. So we have sometimes a bit better coverage, for example, in the US or in Europe. But a global coverage is really something that we really thrive or would like to have in a good granularity. But also we have to be very transparent with our clients or the people we talk to about climate risks, about the uncertainties. And of course, people would like to have like one number. This is going to be my future risk. But we also have to get some understanding for these uncertainties, because in the end, we also don't have a crystal ball, but we're trying to work with the best data possible to have an understanding about how the future would look like.
How susceptible are companies to, or how open are they? And I guess this would not be a one size fits all, but how open are they to taking the advice or the recommendation from you, especially when you're predicting that in 10 years' time, where they're planning on building is not going to be beneficial to them. But as of today, it seems fine. How much pushback do you get?
So of course we get challenged. Of course, the corporates then will tell us, we haven't had an event in 50 years. Why do you think this is an issue now? And all we can tell them is our models show it's an issue. If you cannot prove to me that you did some, let's say, flood protection or some adaptations and measures, then we believe this is the risk. And I think with climate risks and the events that we have more and more frequently in the news, this is helping us a lot to say, okay, you haven't had an event in the past, but look, these other companies didn't either. And now they're surprised. And now they have issues with their supply chain. They have issues to keep their assembly lines running. So it would be much smarter to consider and invest in preventive measures than to take up the insurance. And probably also a good way to start the conversation is insurance prices will potentially adapt to how climate change is impacting the natural catastrophe. So better consider preparing ahead of before that really happens.
So when you do your risk analysis and you present your customers or your clients with the results, what does the results look like? I'm guessing then, based on what you've said, you're not giving them a concrete number. You're going to give them a spread of different options, each with tied to a different likelihood or something like that.
Mhm. So we are giving them an exact number. So we're giving them, for example, an annual expected loss in 2030 or in 2050 for, let's say, your flood risk, your annual expected loss, which is the average of all the events that you may have over a long period of time. So that would be a bit similar to your technical premium that you would pay for as an insurance. So your annual expected loss, let's say today, for this specific site that's in a flood zone today, it's 10 million. But in the future, it may be 12, 15, 18, depending on the different climate change scenario. So that is the difference. So we're giving the clients different numbers for 2030 for 3 different climate change scenarios. We're working with the SSP scenarios. SSP1 is a scenario that says, okay, we're going to decrease our emissions. We're going to achieve the agreements of the Paris climate agreements. So we're really going to significantly reduce as a global society our emissions. SSP2 is a middle of the road scenario. We're not going to achieve net zero by 2050, but we'll have that a bit delayed. And then we're still on a trajectory towards reducing our emissions. And then we have SSP5, which is a bit like the worst case scenario. We're not reducing our emissions, but keep on emitting, keep on using oil and gas. And that is typically the worst case assessment. And then you get different annual expected losses, as I said. So let's say currently you have 10 million under SSP1. In 2030, you'll have 12 million annual expected loss. Under SSP2, you'll have 13. Under SSP5, you'll have 15 million. So you can really see that your difference in how we are as a global society emitting is really then a difference on your balance sheet of how much you'll have to pay for your insurance to still be flood protected. Because, for example, under SSP5, we're expecting a lot more extreme precipitation compared to SSP1.
So once you've actually identified a risk and you've given this information to a company and they take that on board, what what do you give them as actions to do?
So I think really the magic happens less in the assessment and more when you translate it into actions and really adapt to the changed risk landscape. And so we have these risk engineers that I mentioned. So these potentially rubber boots on the ground that we can send all across the globe. They look at the site and then make an assessment about really what would be the impact in case a flood event would happen, a storm would happen, a drought event would happen, or a heat wave would happen. What would be the impacts for your business at that specific site? And then we sit down, actually a climate risk expert sits down with a risk engineer that knows everything about the site, has potentially been there. And then we brainstorm really about how you can, what would be our next steps? If we would own that company, what would we do next? Would we, for example, develop a flood emergency response plan? So in case of a flood warning, you could just get that plan on your desk and then everybody would know what to do. Or we would recommend them to build a flood wall, or we would recommend them for, let's say, heat waves, which we haven't talked about yet. So for heat waves, for example, check if your cooling systems are adequate. So in case you're producing food, for example, the cool chain can never be interrupted. So you really need to make sure in case in the future, extreme temperatures can reach 5 degrees more than you're used to. So is your cooling system still stable at that point? Or do you need different insulation to really withstand there? Do you potentially need some auxiliary power for your heating, cooling, ventilation, whatsoever? Then we would come up really with a list of next steps. What can you do to manage that risk? And we share that with the corporates and cross our fingers that some of that gets implemented.
Mm. One thing I probably should have asked you about when we first started this conversation is what is the scope? What are the different environmental catastrophes? You mentioned storms, you mentioned flooding. What else? What are the big ones that we should probably define up front before giving these details?
Yeah, I think drought, heat wave, wildfires. So the whole water topic will be extremely relevant for us in the future. A lot of clients, so a lot of corporates are using a lot of water for producing their goods. And so this will be a topic that's going to be very high on the agenda going forward, in my opinion. But yeah, so we'll look at precipitation related events, storm related events, sea level rise, drought, wildfire, and these things, and also landslides, for example. Yeah, also tied to extreme precipitation because that increases the probability of landslides, for example. So it's all interconnected, but it's basically water related, land mass related, wind related, and temperature related perils.
Can you just define what is extreme precipitation?
So when it's raining really, really heavily, not over a long period of time, not over several days, but within several hours, let's say, a lot of precipitation is coming down. And that means that water doesn't have time to flow into the rivers, but you can basically have a flood away from the river. So you can have a flash flooding event anywhere around as well. And that's the difference between like a fluvial flood, which is like the river is getting too big and is flooding the areas around it, and a pluvial flood event, which is flash flooding, which can occur anywhere because of extreme precipitation.
Mhm. Out of all of these different areas of focus, which ones impact Switzerland?
Yeah, when I think of Switzerland, I firstly think of the glaciers, because this is something where we're mostly impacted here. And I just listened to talk of professor a month ago, and he said the really water in heavy years, so where we still have enough water, they are now because now the glaciers are melting. But we'll really have more drought and have first less water-rich years in the future. and we're gonna be impacted by that. So when I think of Switzerland, I think of the glaciers. Then also landslides, as we're currently, for example, having a mountain village in evacuating because of this major landslide. Also, these things may be intensifying with climate change. And in Switzerland, I also think of the ski industry, for example. Like the ski seasons are changing. The last years have not had very good snow, and you have to work a lot with artificial snow. So we're also impacting our daily lives with climate risks.
Mm. Do you have any interesting examples of a climate risk assessment that you've done recently for a Swiss company or a Swiss government?
Absolutely. So we work with various different companies all around the globe. But the good examples, it's not a Swiss company, but it's operating all around the globe, is Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners. They are a renewable energy investor. So they're having projects all across the globe with solar projects, wind projects, and we're working together on making their like investments future proof. So we're making sure that you're building a new wind farm with keeping in mind how the wind patterns may change, the different risks will shift. So we're making sure that their investment is really good investment in the very long run as well. So they're prepared for this. Another example for a company that we recently worked with is Lactalis Nestle. They're producing yogurts and mozzarella. So anybody in Switzerland has probably eaten some of their products already. And they're needing a lot of water to produce the food that we're eating. So they need to make sure at their production sites that there still will be enough fresh water in a good quality, so they can be sure that they can produce the goods that we need for our daily lives. And a third quick example that we're currently working on is a pulp and paper company in Asia. Also here, probably everybody has received a package wrapped in their pulp and paper, wrapped in their cartons in the last months. And with them, we're looking at wildfires and flooding of their paper mills, and so various different risks also in Asia. And this is an interesting one because we think it's so far away, but in the end, our global supply chains will make this very real. Also for us in Switzerland, when these companies are struggling with climate risks.
Mm. Maybe you are, maybe you aren't allowed to share it, but what is the process? So they are building a new factory somewhere in Asia because that's the most appropriate place for paper. They go, hey, we want to first make sure that this is environmentally appropriate to build here. They get in contact with you, and the assessment, like what data do you look at? I mean, I know you said you take the
Yeah,
historical data, but what specifically are the data points?
yeah. So what we would get from the corporates we work with is, where is your site? Where's your location? What are you planning to do? So what occupancy types? So what are you actually planning to build there? And then we would run our models that we use also for our insurance pricing. We would run our models and get then like the risk landscape for that specific location. So you can imagine it like you're on Google Maps and you want to map your house and have like a polygon of not just a pin, but really an area. So there, this is my house, this is my area. I want to know how this is impacted. Yes. So then we're running these models and we're getting out the let's say a risk landscape for that specific site. And then we're looking at it together with a risk engineer. We have about 200 risk engineers in our team in Corso of Swiss Re. And so they're specialists for various different industries. And they will then tell you, on one hand side, how these climate risks are really impacting that side. So as I said again before, this is a flash flooding site, but is this at all relevant? If we're looking at a forest, okay, it's flooded, then it's no more flooded. The trees don't mind. If it's a manufacturing site, we really care. So we're looking then at the vulnerabilities and the impacts together with the risk engineer. And then we write up really tangible next steps, so actionable items that we think should be implemented to manage that risk. the risk engineer can go on site as well, and then we'll find some other items. Then we're coming up with a list of risk improvements, and that could be, for example, a recommendation to build a flood wall, a recommendation to move your emergency electricity from the basement to the top floor, because that's what flooding would go first. So that's where the water would go first. So we're then having really a list of recommendations on what they could implement in their site, which they were planning on building or have already built. And we'll write that all in nice reports, and then they can work on it. They can also share that report with their investors. They would be really interested, the investors, to know, is that investment that I'm making, is that resilient, or is that going to be impacted in the future? So yeah, this is then be very relevant information for the different departments within the company. Also the sustainability teams, the insurance teams, the local risk managers, and so on.
Mm. How often do you see the results of your work? So either a company has taken your recommendation and you can see somewhere, oh, look, this has actually done something, or conversely, they haven't taken your recommendation and they're now suffering with the consequences.
Of course, we see both, but these processes take time.
Yeah.
And our platform for the clients to look at data, that exists in 3 years. So it's a really cool platform where you upload your locations, and with a click of a button, you get a report on your risks back, current and future risk, including the financial impacts. I have to say, we are a starting point. Also, our recommendations, they're a starting point. And then you have to make an investment case, and then you have to build that flood wall, for example. So this is a process, and we're like kicking off that process for many corporates. And yes, we do see some results out of it. So once we did for an IT company an assessment of their different offices, and they were thinking of which office they should move. And the one we flagged with the highest risk was in the end the one where they decided to move. So really our assessments went into that board decision-making process, because if you have your server racks there in the basement, that's probably a bad idea. So yes, there is really tangible outcomes, and these information go into decision-making also at the boards.
Mm. Do you see a big variety with all of the different countries or the companies in different countries that you work with? Do you see a big difference in appetite for risk? I mean, I can only imagine the Swiss are the most conservative when it comes to risks.
Absolutely. And one would think so, but I don't always see that. So I just have to say, I think the Asians are doing a really good job at thinking ahead, and at really preparing. I think also they have been the most impacted in the past, so they are really sensitive and towards that topic. The Europeans, I have to say, we like being guided by regulation, and so the EU taxonomy is a good starting point, but we have to be careful to not use these regulations to produce paper, but to really learn something from it and really then do the next steps and translate it into actions. In the US, we have been waiting for regulations, but with the recent shifts in politics, I don't think that the regulations will come. So I find that very, very unfortunate, because especially in the US, they are so heavily impacted. In Florida, with the hurricanes, in California with drought and wildfires. So I think that would be very beneficial for them to in a more structured way to start thinking about their climate risks than they do at the moment. But I feel like they're still like waiting for the regulation. So let's see. So very different approaches around the globe. But I really hope that the interest will further rise, and not only with new events and scary messages in newspapers, but really from an intrinsic wish to make operations more resilient.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting point. From the data that you see, how big is the threat versus the news that the consumer gets? I guess you're in a unique position where you get to actually see data-driven outcomes of the last X amount of years. So what is for you the difference between what you're actually seeing versus what you're hearing in the media and the news?
Well, it really depends on what media and news you're consuming. But I have to say the world will go on, and we will have a lot of local events. What I see as the biggest issue on a global scale is the whole water topic. We're in a very water-rich location in Switzerland, so very privileged position. But many other countries, like even areas of Germany, will have further impacts or will experience droughts. And I come from a little farm in Franconia in Germany. And we are last 2 years, so we have experienced drought on our fields that have been really unprecedented, like my grandmother has never seen before. I think the differences will be, the global differences will increase further. And I think this water topic, this is something that is really going to impact us all around the globe, and where we will have to prepare better in the future. So that would be if I have to single something out, it's less these individual events, but more like the global chronic issue of drought and water scarcity.
And that really comes down to the fact that it's just raining less than it used to.
So we have more extreme precipitation. We have more prolonged durations of no precipitation, and also that depends on where you are on the globe. But in general, I think it's fair to say that the extremes will become more extreme regarding precipitation. And what we would actually need was more like a stable precipitation patterns, and that will shift. So the groundwater levels will fluctuate more than we used to have that in the past.
Mm. I often wonder how much repetition or how much change do you see before you decide that this is due to a changing climate? So if we have
Yeah.
3 very warm summers in a row, there's a percentage of chance that this is just a particular happen to have 3 warm summers in a row. There's nothing
It's
else.
weather.
It's weather. It's weather. At what point do you look at patterns and go, no, this is actually a bigger change and not just the weather changing from year to year?
Mhm. So we really have to differentiate between weather and climate. So weather is what we're seeing when we look out of the window. That's the current weather. What we have this year is the weather. But if we accumulate, or if we look at the averages of weather over 30 years, then we speak of climate. So the climate of 2024, what we're having at the moment, we will only know in 15 years' time, when we really know what happened 50 years before and after, so we can create an average over these 30 years. So, but what we can see is that these 30-year moving averages, that they're really shifting, that we see increased temperatures. Like if you look at the global average temperature year by year, and you really see that every year we're having pretty much another peak, and there's really a trajectory across temperature statistics. So at this point, I find it really hard to be a climate denier when you have so many evidence points so many years as well. So yeah, just look at the temperature statistics, and then you'll hopefully be cured.
Are you optimistic about the future? You deal with risk and you see a lot of the data, but seeing what's to come and seeing how the world is preparing for it, does it make you sleep well at night, or does it keep you up?
I am a very optimistic person by my personality. So of course I sleep well at night because there's only so much I can do, but I can try and talk to corporates and boards about the really importance of climate change. For example, I was speaking to really board of directors of a global oil and gas company, and told them about climate risks, and they were very responsive to it, and we're like, okay, yes, we're aware of this, so let us try to work on this, but also we're waiting for regulation. So I would say that it's a bit of chicken and egg question, that I really hope that politics will put the right regulations in place, because I also think that would make all the differences, and then companies would react accordingly, reduce their emissions, and prepare better. So this is where I think a lot of things will need to happen, but in the end, the sun will rise in the east and set in the west, and let's see how this goes. We're only here so many years.
How has your line of work impacted your personal life and the decisions that you make?
Um, we have recently bought a house, and I definitely made an assessment. So we're in a 500-year return period flood zone. So there's a very small chance of being impacted by flooding. But I think for me, it was very helpful to understand also how corporates think about climate risk and how they really want to become more resilient. And I think everybody should kind of have that mindset of preparing for the future and managing these risks. Um, yeah.
You said water was one of the biggest potential catastrophic things to pay attention to and to be concerned about, but Switzerland is very water rich. What
Mhm.
specifically is the biggest potential catastrophic event which could impact Switzerland?
And many people are not aware that parts of Switzerland are also in earthquake regions. So that would be
I did not know that.
something to consider.
Mm.
But for example, Zurich, the city of Zurich in 2005 had almost a pretty big flood event. And it was at the brink. So nothing happened, but the Siel, which is a river in Zurich, was really to its limits. And at the main station where the Siel is channeled then into the Limmat, that's the narrowest part of it. So this almost flood event really triggered something really very good. So then now the city or the canton has built a channel for water from the Siel to Lake Zurich. That is before the water reaches the city. The channel would take the water from the Siel and put it directly into Lake Zurich, and that would reduce the amount of water that would have to go through the main station. So these kind of projects then that will make the city a lot more flood resilient, because we learned from this almost event. So this is a perfect example of how we should prepare also for climate risks and more extreme precipitation events, to have these structures now in place. And it was a major project. It was 170 million or something. Please don't quote me on that one, but it was a major investment for the canton. But imagine the whole city of Zurich being underwater, the loss of property and also business interruption, impact on people's lives and people's savings. That would be devastating. So this is a very good example of how we in Switzerland are preparing for such impacts.
That's nice to hear. In general, from what you've seen, the Swiss government quite responsive and responsible when it comes to environmental protection?
Oh, I don't want to give judgment on that, but probably compared to other countries on the globe, of course, we got the resources to be prepared.
Mm.
So who if not us? My thoughts are going more towards more vulnerable regions in the global south, especially, that don't have the awareness or the protection or the governmental support in case of an event. So we saw some years ago that Pakistan had major flood events, and that was really extremely devastating to the people there. So I believe with climate risks, again, we in Switzerland, we can prepare very well. We're thinking ahead. We got the models, but it's also very important to support other countries in preparing, for example, future drought events, trying to limit the spread of the Sahara, of deserts, and trying to share more knowledge about water recycling and so on. So, my looks regarding these go more towards the global south.
You said
And yeah,
you said limit the spread of the Sahara. What do you mean by that? The Sahara is getting bigger?
And it is indeed. It is indeed. So there are several projects that are trying to build more vegetation, especially at the south. So it's spreading further to the south. The Sahara is getting bigger. At this point, it's growing.
That's interesting. We haven't talked so much about heat. How does I wonder this? How does a heat wave negatively impact a city or a company?
In the recent years, so we have been through some heat waves in Switzerland. And I think everybody feels that productivity is going down when it's just 35 degrees outside, and also health impacts. So if you're, for example, if you're on a construction site, you'll probably need to pause building, or you need to, install additional ventilation for your workers, give them additional water breaks, and so on. But also, as a society, mortality rates are impacted by heat waves, for example. For elderly people, heat waves are more or harder to bear than for young and healthy people. So yes, it impacts us in different ways. And for example, the city of Singapore is a very good example. They have built a lot of, or they have planted a lot of green spaces and really reduced the temperature in the city, and made it just a much more livable place, even during very warm periods. And I think this is something we need to learn also in Switzerland, have less of these concrete sealed spaces that will be so hot when you walk over it, but more green spaces that will also really reduce the temperature in the cities. So I think the whole city planning needs to be aware of heat waves and heat related issues, health issues in the future. So yes, on one hand, that corporates, productivity, workers' health, but on the other hand, really also city planning.
Yeah, I do understand that. I mean, coming from Australia, it's very hot, but also the buildings are built differently. And here, the buildings are built to keep the heat in because of the cold weather.
Yes.
If you get something above 30 degrees, it is a difficult place to be in a small apartment. So yeah, I don't know what the solution to that is, a practical one. It's a big investment to find a way to make buildings cooler for everybody.
Yeah, and in my opinion, the solution should not be everybody gets air conditioned.
Okay.
I would really like to not live in a world where I have to be in a concealed space all the time and cannot just open my window. That's really not the vision I have for the future. So yes, let's hope greenery and more green spaces and fountains will be the better solution than everybody locking themselves in with air conditioners.
Now, I have one final question for you. If there is one or two things which you would advice or wisdom which you could give to the listeners, which you gather by the job that you do, what would that be? Something which the average person walking on their way to work right now can think about, insights which you've gained specifically from your line of work.
Just start thinking of climate change as not as something that is coming back to us, something that we're causing, but then it's really also coming back to us. So it will impact us. The impacts are already there. So I think it's really in our hand to decide which climate change scenario we will be on. And then also, not to scare anybody, but let's try and just mentally prepare. We're probably going to live in a bit of a different climate in the future. And it's on us to shape that right now by, for example, voting, or for example, taking the train in this excellent train system that we have in Switzerland. I would say it's a gorgeous world we live in. Let's try and keep it as cool as it is.
And maybe do your research before buying a house on the beach or next to a river.
Oh yes, and they're 100%. So don't get scammed by not understanding what you're getting. And as a corporate, to really think about your processes and think about how climate risk may impact you beyond just the typical ones like flooding and storm, but really also heat and drought.
Well, Annemarie, this has been a very insightful conversation. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me, Court. Like, it was an amazing time. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Ciao, ciao.
Thanks for listening. If you did enjoy the episode and you want to support me, it would mean a lot if you could rate the episode and follow the podcast on your favorite platform. It really helps the show grow and reach more people. I'll see you in the next episode.